5.7 million older men in America live alone right now, not in nursing homes, not in assisted living, but alone in their own houses. And while the world seems determined to frame every one of them as a tragedy, the truth is far more complicated, far more interesting, and far more worthy of respect than any headline about a loneliness epidemic would have you believe. In May of 2023, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy released a landmark advisory declaring loneliness and isolation a public health epidemic in the United States, and the 5.7 million older men living alone sat squarely at the center of that concern. But the full story, according to researchers at Harvard Medical School and the National Institute on Aging, is far more nuanced than the headlines suggest. This is the story of what it actually means to be an older man living on your own, the real risks, the real rewards, and the quiet strength that nobody talks about. Start with the numbers, because the numbers tell a story most people don't expect. In 1950, just 9% of all American adults lived by themselves. Today, 28% of Americans 65 and older live alone, and that's 16.2 million people. Women make up the larger share, around 10.5 million, but the 5.7 million men living solo represent a population the size of a major American state, one that's growing fast. By 2038, Harvard researchers estimate that the majority of people 80 and older, roughly 10 million Americans, will be what demographers now call solo agers, not a fringe group, not an anomaly, the new normal. So how did we get here? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't entirely sad. Lower marriage rates, a surge in what researchers call gray divorce, couples splitting after 50, after the kids are gone, after decades together. Greater longevity, meaning more years spent in widowhood. Smaller families, children who live across the country or across the world. A dramatic decline in poverty among older Americans, which means more people can afford to live independently. And something else, something important, the desire to age in place, to stay in the home you built your life in. 80% of people living alone after 65 are either divorced or widowed, which is twice the rate of the general population. And here's something that might surprise you. Men 55 and older are more than twice as likely as women to remarry. A 2022 study from Bowling Green State University confirmed that, and other research suggests they're often choosing younger spouses. So the men who remain alone, many of them have chosen it, or at least chosen not to rush into something that doesn't feel right. Now here's where the conversation usually turns dark. The risks are real, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend otherwise. Murthy's language in that 2023 advisory was striking. He said, "We have an opportunity and an obligation to make the same investments in addressing social connection that we have made in addressing tobacco use, obesity, and the addiction crisis." He wasn't being dramatic. The data backed him up. Social isolation carries a health risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The CDC has linked it to a 50% increase in dementia risk. The National Institute on Aging has identified social isolation as one of the most significant modifiable risk factors in elderly health outcomes. Research shows that the risk of dying from all causes ran 56% higher for somewhat isolated men, and more than doubled for very isolated men, compared to those who weren't isolated at all. For men without a partner, the risk of dying increased by roughly 45%. Heart disease, high blood pressure, obesity, weakened immune function, depression, cognitive decline. The list reads like a medical textbook. And by age 65, 1 in 4 men meets the clinical criteria for total social isolation. 1 in 4. But here's the thing, and this is what really changes the story. Living alone and being isolated are not the same thing, not even close. Dr. Sachin Shah, an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School who researches solo agers, put it this way. Older adults who live alone are generally healthier, more cognitively capable, and more socially connected than the broad group of older people living with their spouse or adult children because they have to be. Think about that for a moment. The men who successfully live alone aren't doing it despite their health and sharpness, they're doing it because of it. They have to stay on top of things, manage their own meals, their own schedules, their own medical appointments. They have to think clearly, act independently, maintain connections. Shaw added a crucial caveat though. The other side of the coin is they're more vulnerable when anything happens because they don't always have the support of others. That vulnerability is real. It's the fall in the bathroom with no one to call. It's the stroke in the middle of the night, the slow cognitive decline you can't see in yourself. This is the tightrope, and millions of men walk it every single day. So what separates the men who thrive from the men who don't? Researchers have spent years trying to answer that, and what they've found points to something you might not expect. It's not wealth, though that helps. It's not having a large social circle, though that matters too. The single greatest predictor of whether an older man thrives alone comes down to something deceptively simple: routine. A study out of the University of Pittsburgh found that 37.6% of participating seniors who rose early, stayed active during the day, and maintained consistent daily routines showed significantly better cognitive function than other participants. These adults woke before 7 in the morning and stayed active for 15 hours, day in and day out. Stephen Smagala, the researcher behind the findings, said, "There's something about getting going early, staying active all day, and following the same routine each day that seems to protect older adults." What's exciting about these findings is that activity patterns are under voluntary control, which means that making intentional changes to one's daily routine could improve health and wellness. Under voluntary control, that's the key phrase. This isn't about genetics or luck. It's about decisions you make every morning when the alarm goes off. Research on what scientists call positive solitude has revealed something fascinating on top of that. A study published in a leading journal found that positive solitude, the ability to find meaning and contentment in time spent alone, actually reduced depressive symptoms. Not just neutral, actively protective. Men who learned to savor their time alone, who found purpose in their hours rather than dread, showed weaker associations between loneliness and depression. Positive solitude acted as a buffer, a psychological shield. On days when participants practiced what researchers call time savoring, deliberately appreciating and staying present during their alone hours, they reported lower depressive mood and fewer physical symptoms. The solitude itself didn't change. Their relationship with it did. There's even a biological explanation for why older men can be better at this than younger ones. As people age and their social networks naturally shrink, their preference for solitude actually increases. This isn't just resignation. Older adults show more favorable emotional and even biological outcomes from solitude compared to middle-aged and younger adults. The capacity to be alone well deepens with age, like a skill you've been unconsciously practicing your entire life. The British Psychological Society published findings on what they call the recharge cycle. The idea is elegant. Our needs for social time and solitude move in opposite directions, like two ends of a seesaw. A lunch with a friend meets your need to belong but depletes your energy, and afterward you need time alone to recover. This is especially true for older people with more limited energy reserves. The men who understand this rhythm, who give themselves permission to pull back after socializing without guilt, tend to do significantly better. But the barriers are worth naming directly because they're specific to men. A landmark UK study conducted between 2017 and 2018 followed 72 men between the ages of 65 and 95. What researchers found was that masculinity itself acts as both a barrier and an enabler in dealing with loneliness. The men in the study described three core strategies. First, maintaining silence around loneliness and distress, simply not talking about it. Second, a tension between stoic coping and genuine despair, what the researchers called getting on with it versus feeling stuck. And third, seeking temporary remedies and distractions from within the home, television, crossword puzzles, puttering in the garage. The traditional masculine ideal, the one most of these men were raised with, says you don't complain, you handle it, you keep moving. And in many ways, that stoicism serves them. It gets them through the day, keeps the routine going, but it also builds walls around the very conversations that could save their lives. Ken Elliott, a retired psychology professor now living alone in Maine, spoke with rare candor about this. He said, "Aging without a mythic family support system, which everyone assumes people have, is tough for everybody." That word mythic is important. We carry around this image of old age surrounded by grandchildren, a devoted spouse, Sunday dinners. For millions of men, that image doesn't match reality, and the gap between the myth and the truth can be its own source of pain. This is where programs like Men's Sheds become not just useful, but vital. The concept started in Australia and has spread across Canada, the UK, and into parts of the United States. The premise is simple but brilliant. Give older men a physical space, a workshop, a shed where they can work on projects side by side. Woodworking, metalwork, repairs, community projects. The genius is in the design. These aren't support groups where you sit in a circle and share your feelings. They're workbenches where you stand shoulder to shoulder and build something. And that shoulder-to-shoulder dynamic is everything. Researchers found that this parallel engagement, working alongside someone rather than facing them across a table, enables men to talk about sensitive and even shameful topics, including health problems and symptoms, in ways they never would in a traditional therapeutic setting. The conversation happens naturally, almost accidentally, while hands are busy and eyes are focused on a task. Men's Sheds address the social determinants of health by meeting men exactly where they are, not where we wish they'd be. And Men's Sheds aren't alone. Programs like Meals on Wheels, which reaches more than 2 million homebound seniors annually, offer something beyond a hot meal. They provide one of the most consistent human contact points in an isolated man's week. The Village to Village Network, a nationwide organization supporting people who want to age in place, connects older adults to volunteer services, social events, and peer support in their own communities. AARP Foundation's Connect to Affect program specifically targets isolated seniors and links them to local resources, and the often overlooked Area Agencies on Aging, a nationwide network of more than 600 local organizations funded under the Older Americans Act, serve as the connective tissue between isolated older men and everything from transportation to meal delivery to Medicare counseling. These aren't fringe programs, they're infrastructure, and they exist in nearly every county in the country. There's something else the research reveals, something we might call the paradox of solitude. Studies found that elderly people can experience solitude as isolation, especially when they're ill. But in those very same circumstances, some people experience solitude as evidence of maturity, as an achievement, as proof that they've built a life sturdy enough to stand on its own. The home itself sits at the center of this paradox. Research shows that an older man's home functions simultaneously as a restrictive environment that compounds loneliness and as a space of biographical connection that brings comfort. The chair your wife sat in, the workbench your father used, the kitchen where you made Saturday pancakes for your kids. These objects and spaces anchor a man to his own story, reminding him who he is. And maintaining that home, keeping it clean, keeping it functional, keeping it alive, becomes the daily act of meaning that holds everything together. 40% of solo agers in an AARP survey reported finding joy in their independence, not just coping with it. Joy. The freedom to eat what you want when you want, to watch what you want, to go to bed at 8 or stay up until midnight, to organize your day around your own rhythms without negotiation or compromise. After decades of responsibility for others, many of these men describe a sense of liberation they didn't expect. And here's a finding that surprised even the researchers. Older single men are happier than younger single men. This aligns with broader research showing that people tend to be more satisfied with long-term singlehood after age 40. Younger men feel the social pressure to couple up more acutely, while older men have made their peace with their situation, or even come to prefer it. The research also reveals a more complicated undercurrent, though. Even among older men who report low desire for a romantic partner, there's a corresponding dip in overall life satisfaction. Men may struggle with building social support networks outside of romantic partnerships, and that's the deeper issue. A wife wasn't just a wife. She was often the social coordinator, the one who maintained friendships, planned gatherings, stayed in touch with family. When she's gone, whether through death or divorce, many men find themselves not just without a partner, but without the entire social infrastructure she built. Researchers identify two pathways for coping with this. The first is problem-based, actively seeking to improve relationships with others, joining a club, calling an old friend, volunteering. The second is emotion-focused, changing your expectations about relationships, accepting a smaller circle, finding contentment with less. The data shows that older adults practice both, but as men age further, they lean more heavily toward emotional regulation, toward lowering expectations rather than building new connections. Whether that's wisdom or surrender probably depends on the individual. So where does all of this leave us? The honest picture is that 5.7 million older men are navigating one of the most demanding challenges in human experience, the challenge of aging alone in a society that worships youth and togetherness. Some of them are struggling badly. The health data is unambiguous about the risks. Isolation kills, but many of them are doing something remarkable. They're getting up every morning, maintaining routines that protect their minds and bodies, finding meaning in the small things, the morning coffee, the walk around the block, the afternoon in the workshop. They're learning, whether they'd use the word or not, the art of positive solitude. They're proving that there's a difference between being alone and being lost. The numbers will only grow. By 2038, 10 million Americans over 80 will be solo agers. The question isn't whether this trend continues, it will. The question is whether we'll build the infrastructure, the men's sheds, the Meals on Wheels routes, the area agencies on aging, the community programs, the medical awareness, the cultural respect to support the men inside those numbers. Dr. Murthy was right to sound the alarm, but he was also right to frame it as an opportunity. Because within this epidemic of loneliness, there are millions of men quietly demonstrating something the rest of us could stand to learn. That solitude, handled with intention and routine and even a little grace, doesn't have to be a sentence. It can be a practice, a discipline, and for some it becomes a kind of freedom they never knew they were looking for. If you're one of those 5.7 million men, or if you know one, understand this: the quiet strength is real, and it deserves to be seen.